All right, we've started. So today I'm going to give the third and final lecture of this week, which is going to be on Moore's Law. And then, because the schedulers have put the tutorial block immediately after this, which is actually my preference, we can use the tutorial time as well to discuss general stuff that's come out of the first couple of lectures, or maybe even allowing a little bit of overrun time. I think this lecture might run a little bit long. Okay. So as I said, this is going to be about Moore's Law. How many of you have heard of Moore's Law? Okay, so that's only maybe 3 people out of the, I haven't done the head count today, but I guess maybe 25 of you are here or something. I'm a little bit surprised. I thought it's something that you would at least know of, but it sounds like you don't, but that's fine, because I'm going to go through it in adequate detail. The main thing about Moore's Law is it's a way of explaining some of the logic of how computer technology has evolved in the way that it has and at the speed that it has. So if you remember the quick tour of computer game history that I did on Monday, you could see that obviously the machines get more sophisticated over time. It turns out there's like a pattern to that is understood, and Moore's Law helps you understand it. Okay, so this is another historical thing, so I thought I would do some little remarks about the nature of history. There's a website that's got a bunch of definitions of what history is. They're kind of intended to be humorous or, kind of brief little memorable phrases. I wrote some of them down for you. History is just one damn thing after another. What is history but a fable agreed upon? Because obviously there's a consensus as to what things people choose to pay attention to when they're writing histories. Another one, an account mostly false of events mostly unimportant. It's a bit mean. But it's also been said that the causes of events are ever more interesting than the events themselves. Now, that's my slightly pretentious way of trying to excuse telling you about Moore's Law. The clever thing about it is that in addition to giving you a guide to historical trends, it also has, and in the past, had predictive power. It actually lets you work out where things are going to be a couple of years down the line. And that in itself is an interesting thing to know. So it's about explaining why the computer revolution took place in the way that it did, at the speed that it did. General piece of advice about quotes. You should always be skeptical about quotes that you hear. You probably know that. You've grown up with the internet, right? And especially the attributions. I'm sure you've seen it all. Very share-worthy quote with some famous person's name attached to it. It's almost always the wrong name. And the quote's usually made up as well. This is true of lots of people. Watch out for Einstein quotes. Also, especially watch out for Churchill quotes, which are notoriously not actually from Churchill. Just thought I'd mention that. Okay, but before we get into Moore's Law properly, I have a little digression for you, one of my silly little videos, about a series of tubes. Back in the dark ages in 2006, the Alaskan Senator Ted Stevens was trying to explain how the internet worked to Congress when they were trying to put through one of the silly laws about, restricting internet access, all this kind of net neutrality stuff back in the early days. And in his attempts to explain what the internet is, he said, and I quote, "The internet is not a big truck. It's a series of tubes." The people who are on the internet ran with this, of course, and this became quite a popular meme for a while, pointing out that the internet is not a big truck. And this is what they did with that.
The internet is not a big truck. The internet is not something that you just dump something on. The internet is not a big truck. The internet is a series of tubes. The internet is not a big truck. The internet is not something that you just dump something on. The internet is not a big truck. The internet streaming stuff on the internet. Why? Tubes. The internet is tubes. Connections, consumers, mass, commercial purposes. Big truck, long distance is tubes. Tangled up tubes. Enormous series of tubes. Your own personal internet. The World Wide Web. The internet is tubes. Those tubes can be filled. And if they're filled, the internet is going to be a series of tubes. The internet is not a big truck. The internet is not something that you just dump something on. I want to make sure people understand my position. This system, these people are asking for regulation, okay? I just the other day got internet was sent by my staff at 10 o'clock in the morning on Friday. I got it yesterday. See, we want to talk about the consumer. Let's talk about you and
Chairman,
me.
Al?
Yes, sir.
I'm sorry. I thought you were finished. I'm sorry.
No, I'm not finished. These people are massively invading this world of the internet. Why? Tubes. The internet is tubes. Providers, consumers, movies delivered to your house. Big truck, small business is tubes. Tangled up tubes. Enormous series of tubes. Your own personal internet. The World Wide Web. The internet is tubes. Those tubes can be filled. And if they're filled, the internet is going to be delayed. A series of tubes. The internet is providers. The internet is consumers. The internet is you and me. The internet is not a big truck. People who are streaming through a whole book at a time. Maybe there is a place for the internet. And again, the internet is a series of tubes.
I would say he was half right. The internet is not a big truck. I don't think it's really a series of tubes either. I mean, God bless him, I know what he was trying to say, but that's not the right way to say it. But tubes are of some historical interest to, if not the internet, to computers. Because computers used to be made from tubes. That is a series of tubes. I mentioned these on Monday. So these are what Americans call tubes, vacuum tubes. In British English, they're called valves. The word valve has got the other meaning. It can mean like a water valve, but it also means these things. And these are the basic components that old-fashioned computers from like the 1940s were actually made from. So here you go, vacuum tubes, or also known as thermionic valves. And I'm going to tell you a bit about these because it's pertinent to what Moore's law is talking about. So the first type of vacuum tube is a thing called a diode. You maybe know about modern diodes from your electronics classes. You know, the little component that only conducts electricity in one direction. But the old diodes, the vacuum diodes, were built like this, and they were basically, you can think of them as being like an old-fashioned light bulb. You know, light bulbs used to just be electricity running through like a tungsten wire that would make it go hot and it would glow. Modern LED lights are different, but that's the way they used to be. And the basic idea on these things, well, the diode thing was that you would have a central element that was a bit like a light bulb filament, and it would get hot, and when it got hot enough, the electrons would kind of come off it, and electrons are negatively charged, so if you've got a positive charge on the outside at the anode, you could attract the electrons towards the anode, and if you do that and they go to the anode and then you take them away somewhere, you've got an electric circuit, albeit partly travelling through air, but it's conducting, but it will only conduct in that direction. If you reverse the polarity, it won't work because you don't have the heat in the right place. So that's what an old diode used to be like. Then one step up from that was a thing called a triode, and the triode added this third element, the grid, which is this mesh thing in the gap between the cathode and the anode. And now you can do some additional things. The voltage that you put on the grid can be used to kind of pull the electrons to a greater or lesser degree through the circuit that you're making. And that allows you to, by controlling the voltage on the grid, you can create an electrically controlled switch. So you can put a current into the grid that will tell you whether the other current flows or not. So now you can make this electric current either flow or not flow based on some other trigger. So electric switching, which turns out to be really useful. Also amplification as well. This is how like hi-fis used to amplify sound signals and everything. So what can you do with diodes and triodes? Well, among other things, you can in fact build high-speed digital electronic computers, which is what was done. And then eventually you'll be able to make games with them. Here are some old archive pictures of these tube-based computers. You can see here these old ones, a couple of people operating them here. Okay. Does anyone remember the Valve Steam box or Steam machine? Okay, so the company Valve, the games company, they tried to make like a custom PC some years ago, and they called it the Steam machine. It was a little thing they tried to do for a while. The original Steam machine, though, would be a 1940 style computer, which used thousands of these little vacuum tubes that I've just described, and put them together to build this big computing system that was used during the war for code cracking. You may actually, when you hear Colossus, you might think that it was used to crack the Enigma code. That's not strictly true. Colossus was for cracking the Lorenz code, which was an even fancier code that the Germans used for the submarines, or for the high command. Anyway, so the Colossus machine did indeed use valves, aka tubes, although it wasn't steam-based. It would have been had it run from the normal electricity supply, because in most places electricity is derived from steam, or in Iceland, well, it just derived from free steam. In Britain, it's derived from coal steam. But it turns out during the war, the electricity supply was the main supply was uncertain, so it actually ran on diesel instead rather than steam power. Okay, so these valves were an improvement on the previous technology, which was electromechanical relays. These things were better than that. But valves are big, as you can see from the picture. A valve is like a substantial sized unit, and it's basically a modified light bulb. So like light bulbs, they run hot, and they can be unreliable. They break quite a lot, cause a lot of practical problems. At this point, I will jump ahead a little bit. This is a little aside. From this same period in the 40s, there's a guy called Vannevar Bush, who was an important scientist in America, and he wrote an essay called As We May Think, where he was looking at the technology of that period, just the immediate post-war period, and trying to extrapolate where it might go as things got better over time, as he thought that miniaturization was going to be a thing, and everything would shrink and become a lot better. And it's a really fascinating paper if you want to read it. It was I say paper, it's actually just an article in a magazine called The Atlantic. And he discusses where he thought technology was going to go. And it's really funny. He thought that basically people would have the equivalent of a personal computer, but instead of it being the size of like several rooms, the way computers were at the time, it would be so effectively miniaturized that it would fit in an entire desk. So his idea was that your desk would in fact be a computer. And all the data that you had would be miniaturized using microfilm. So the drawers of your desk would be full of tiny little microfilms that you still sometimes get in libraries. And there'd be a mechanism and a keyboard, and you would type things in, and it would search through the microfilm to find the thing that you had searched for, and it would put it up on a display, and it would and it was indexed in a clever way so that it knew where different keywords were on the microfilm. Basically, it was anticipating a kind of nearly there version of the web, but not quite right, and based on weird photographic technology like microfilm and so on. But it's a really interesting paper. In fact, I'm pretty sure the Google guys know this paper, the guys, Sergey and Larry, because there's a bit in it where when he speculates about the future, he talks about people having miniaturized cameras that you could wear on your head that would take pictures of your daily activity in your life. Basically, it's Google Glass, if you remember that joke from some years ago, and it's in this thing that was written in 1945. Okay, but part of the reason I mention this, in addition to it being an interesting historical thing, is it's got a wonderful understatement in it where he's anticipating the future, and he says, "The world has arrived at an age of cheap, complex devices of great reliability, and something is bound to come of it." Something did come of it. The computer revolution, which absolutely hadn't started yet, but the seeds of it were maybe there, was basically kind of what Vannevar was anticipating, even though he didn't know how he would do it, because there was a key piece of technology that hadn't been invented yet that he didn't know about. So what actually happened was, in 1947, a team at Bell Labs invented, or depending on how you look at it, maybe reinvented, a way of creating really small, low-powered, cool, non-thermal, efficient, reliable, shock-resistant equivalents of the triode valve. They took this big, ugly thing that you had to build computers out of, and they miniaturized it into something really tiny. Does anyone know what that thing was? Not want to guess? Okay, the transistor. That's what the transistor is. The transistor is basically a super miniaturized valve, and that's what made all the modern tech that we have possible, because transistors are so much smaller and cheaper and more reliable than valves were. And the transistor changed the world, and it was only invented in 1947. So within a lifetime, if you've got like a grandparent in their 70s or something, they might have been born before 1947. If so, they were born into a world with no transistors in it. And now they're everywhere, in everything. How many of you have seen transistors? You actually seen like discrete components, yeah, like that. So this is it. They've got kind of 3 legs on them. That's the kind of the equivalent of the cathode, anode, and grid, almost from a valve. Of course, this is the kind of these are big transistors. These are standalone transistors you would use if you were an electronics hobbyist. But the kind of things that we deal with in computers, we usually have. It's even smaller than that. We have the transistors are super miniaturized onto an integrated circuit, which looks like that. So this is a very early IC. I think this is like from the 1970s. I had to get an old one because the new ones are so dense you couldn't really see anything, right? So this gives you like an early IC where all this kind of stuff on here are even more tiny transistors all packed together onto a silicon wafer. Okay. So you already have realised from Monday's lecture that obviously there's been a huge arc of progress from the primitive 1940s computers to the 70s and 80s games machines and the kind of things that we have now. And that was in part via the transistor and also via the integrated circuit, as I've just mentioned. And basically what made it all possible was just being able to put more tiny transistors on a sliver of silicon. And the more you can put on it, the more you can do with it. And that's how computers become better over time. An example of that would be if you look at the original Pong game that Ralph Baer did. He did that, remember, with the brown box, which is the circuit that he built that was full of a couple of dozen transistors and resistors just wired together, individual components, and it could do Pong. But then by 1980, we had Pac-Man, where you had thousands upon tens of thousands of transistors on an integrated circuit in a CPU chip, all just running as a single device, and that's why Pac-Man can be a more complicated thing than
the ball comes in from that. The ball
than the bat and ball game.
Thank you.
So that was only a period of 12 years, and I think it was a factor of like tens of thousands in terms of the transistor density between these two devices. Yeah, several. I think actually it's probably tens of thousands. So this is where Moore's law comes in. So there's a guy called Gordon Moore who wrote a paper in 1965, which was during the early development of the integrated circuit. And he wrote a magazine article, very short, it's only 3 pages. And what he did is he anticipated that the number of transistors you could fit on a silicon chip would double roughly every year. And he thought, well, if that trend continues, you could anticipate where things would be, down the line. He did not call it Moore's law. People generally don't. People are not arrogant enough to name things after themselves. But it came to be associated with him. So as of 1970, Carver Mead spoke about this paper, and he called it Moore's law, and that's why we now call it that. So if you want to see the original article, I have got a link for it here. It's that one there. So this is it, just a very short article about cramming more components onto integrated circuits. And there it is, that's the whole thing. But it's super important, right? Basically, the whole electronics and semiconductor industry is built on the idea of Moore's law in a certain sense. It's amazingly influential. So here's what Moore actually said. He said a couple of things. One thing is that he anticipated that integrated circuits will lead to such wonders as home computers. You got that right. Or at least terminals connected to a central computer. Automated controls for automobiles. Not quite sure what he means by that, but certainly modern cars are full of transistorized electronics and indeed full-on computers. And that's before you add self-driving. Even kind of standard issue cars have got quite complex computers in them now. And personal portable communications equipment. Well, your phone, right? That's part of the same trend. Indeed, the electronic wristwatch, which hadn't quite been invented yet, but he could anticipate that it was coming feasible by just extrapolating this doubling law. So he thought in 1965 that really you only had to figure out how to do the display technology and you'd be able to build a digital watch. And indeed, the first digital watch of note arrived in about 1972. And famously, James Bond had one in Live and Let Die, and that was his gadget for that film, the super high-tech gadget that he had, a watch. And the displays on those early watches were so bad; they were based on bad LEDs before LCDs came along, and they used so much power that you couldn't keep the display on all the time. So it would only show the display when you press the button. So it was a watch that you had to press the button to show the time on it. A bit like Fitbits now, where they don't work unless you move them because the displays are so inefficient. Yeah, like that. So it all comes full circle. But here's the real core of Moore's law, the thing that made the paper famous. What Moore said was there's a minimum cost at any given time in the evolution of the technology. At present, that's reached when 50 components are used per circuit. What he's saying there is you could put 20 transistors on a chip if you wanted to, or you could put 50, or you could put 100, right? But if you put 100, you're trying to put too many on it, and your failure rates will be high, so it won't be economically viable because it's quite hard to make these things produce successful parts. So if you try and squeeze too many components on a chip, you'll just get failure rates, and it won't be economical. On the other hand, if you put too few on it, you're kind of wasting. It's like you only put 10 transistors on that chip, and if you could have put 20 without a big failure rate, you should have put 20 on it because the cost is the cost of the chip. It's not the cost of the transistors. So there's always like a sweet spot about the kind of optimal number of transistors to put on your chip. And that's the number he cares about. And he's saying that the complexity for minimum component cost, so that's like the most economically viable number of transistors, increases by roughly a factor of 2 every year. He also said that over the long term, the rate of increase is a bit more uncertain, but there's no reason to believe that it won't remain true for at least 10 years, he thought, at that time. And here's the graph that he includes in his paper. So this is the thing that I'm saying, that if it's in 1962, well, first of all, this is a doubly logarithmic graph. Hopefully you're familiar with logarithmic scales. I think the COVID era has made people familiar with logarithmic scales because they're used quite a lot. So this is just where instead of your scale being like a linear, so it's not 10, 20, 30, 40, it's 10, 100, 1,000, 10,000. There are some things where it just makes more sense to graph them that way. So he's saying that in 1962, you could put 2 transistors on your chip, or you can maybe put 10 on it, or you can maybe put 30 on it or something. But this is the optimum point. This is the point where you get the best bang for your buck, as it were. Right? And he's saying that's the sweet spot of 1962. But he's saying that in 1965, another 3 years down the line, you'll probably be able to put 8 times as many per chip efficiently. So the cost for component will go down correspondingly by a factor of 8 to 10, so it gets cheaper, and then it gets cheaper again in 1970, and this just keeps happening. So your transistors get smaller and cheaper over time. There's another way of looking at that where you can just say for any given year, and the years are linear here, look at how many components you could fit on the chip, but again you use the logarithm of the component. So this is like the 2 to the power value. So this 6 here means 2 to the power 6, which is, anyone know? 64. Yeah, so that's 64. So again, in 1964, you could put 64 transistors on a chip. In 1965, he thought it'd be 128. And it looked like this is the trend that he saw, and he thought, I think there are reasons to believe this will continue. So he would extrapolate it and say, by the 70s, we'll be able to put 2 to the power 16, which is 65,000. Transistors on a chip, which would be an amazing number. I mean, if you think back in the 60s where they're only putting like 30 on a chip, and somebody's telling you, I think in 10 years we'll be able to do 16,000, that would kind of seem a bit much. But that was his claim. But prediction is difficult, especially about the future. That's a famous quote. So Moore didn't anticipate that you'd get 65,000 components on a chip by 1975. I looked at the real data, and it turned out that Intel, the company that Gordon Moore ended up founding, that in 1976, which is close enough, they had made a chip that had 6,500 transistors on it. So that's actually, is that good or is that not good? I mean, off by a factor of 10 is quite a lot, but, it's in the right universe at least. And in fact, there are some caveats here. What Moore was talking about wasn't strictly transistors, he was talking about components. And that would include things like capacitors and resistors as well, which you can also put on an integrated circuit. And at that same year, in the mid-1970s, Intel were working on a memory chip that had 32,000 components on it, or would have done if they'd released it. So it wasn't too far off. The trend was, given that he's he's anticipating scales of hundreds and thousands. To be off by 10 is not terrible. And in fact, by 1975, Moore had revised his prediction a little bit. Instead of saying that he thought it would double every year, he thought that there were reasons to think that the trend was going to slow down a bit, and it would actually double every 2 years, which is slower. And that's kind of the modern version of the law, that the number of components you can fit on a chip seems to double every 2 years. Yeah, so Intel got a self-promoting infographic about this. So there's Moore. And there's a timeline where it shows you from the 60s up to the early 2000s in this case. And you see this thing it's almost a line on a logarithmic scale. If it looks like a line, but the scales are going up by like a factor of 10 for every step, then that's your logarithmic thing, and that's what logarithmic growth looks like on a log curve. And here's another version of it. Again, this is an old one, but this was from Wikipedia back in the day, just to stop it being too Intel-centric. And you can see the same basic trend. It looks like a line, but it's logarithmic scaled on this side, so that would mean that if you drew it linearly, it would be that whooping log curve where it goes up super fast, so fast that you can't really make sense of it. That's why you plot them on a log curve instead, so you can see the trend a bit more simply. And you can see that by 2010 or 11, you are at the level of billions of transistors on a single chip, which is just a kind of incredible number. And the trend did continue. People are always saying it won't continue. People are always saying, we're running out of steam on Moore's law. It won't keep going. And eventually that will be true. It has to be true eventually, right? But it keeps being not true yet. So if you look at more recent data up to 2020, it's basically the same idea. It's this big linear curve that keeps going, and now we're at the point where we've got nearly 50 billion on a single chip. Kind of incredible. And it's harder and harder to do this. When they miniaturize it, they're starting to run into all sorts of physical limits, and they have to do all sorts of cunning tricks to make it keep getting better. But so far they've been able to find ways of doing it. So chip density has gone up in this somewhat predictable fashion for 50 plus years now. So this all has an effect on things in the real world, right? Because if you can put more transistors on a chip, first of all, more transistors, you can just do more of whatever it is you were doing. If you were computing stuff, get more transistors, you can compute more things. Your computer will be faster. At least that's part of it. The other thing is that as the transistors get smaller, you can run the clocks at higher speeds as well. So not only have you got more transistors, but they're individually being clocked at a higher rate, and that has a compounding effect sometimes, up to a point. And in fact, this leads to the idea that a fellow called David Howes noted that Moore is saying that the number of components is doubling every 2 years. But because you get the benefit of the doubling of the components and you get a clock speed improvement, that it would turn out that the performance of the chip would actually double faster than that. Instead of the performance doubling every 24 months, it would double every 18 months. Now, this is really subtle, right? And this is what a lot of people used to think Moore's law was. Even if you asked computer professionals, they would tend to say, Moore's law says that computers get twice as fast every 18 months. That isn't what Moore said. Moore said component density doubles every 24 months. And what Moore said is still true. This other thing about the performance doubling every 18 months is not true some more. It hasn't been true for even maybe 10 years now, because the clock speeds have all kind of reached certain limits. Like, your modern clock speed's about 3 gigahertz, and it was 3 gigahertz 5 years ago as well. They've kind of frozen there a little bit. So the thing to watch out for is that Moore's law does not just say that computers will get twice as fast every so often. It specifically says that the number of components on a chip will double every so often, where every so often is 2 years. So this kind of thing is indeed what's called exponential growth in the strict, in the technical sense. Exponential growth means that the rate of growth of a thing is proportionate to its own value, as you hopefully remember from your calculus, an e to the x type curve, where the derivative is the same as the value. The other way of thinking about that is that you can say that the value changes by a fixed factor of f over a fixed period of time t. So when I say doubles every 24 months, that's describing exponential behaviour. And as I said earlier, that means you'll get a straight line if you do it on a logarithmic graph. This is commonly misused, right? Lots of people talk about exponential all the time.
You keep using the word. I don't think it means what you think it means.
A lot of people think that exponential just means fast or a lot. So in like common speech, you'll hear people often talking about exponential growth. They might just be talking about polynomial growth, which isn't technically not the same thing. Which you have to watch out for if you're being technical. So for example, the function x squared, again, if you plot that, it goes up and it gets steeper all the time. It's definitely a curve that gets faster, but it's not an exponential. That's just not the same thing. But 2 to the power x would be exponential, and x to the power 2 is not. So that's a kind of pedantic distinction, but it's worth bearing in mind if you're talking technically, just to not get confused about which things are exponential and which are not. On the subject of exponentials, it can be very useful to remember some of these little things that I've got here that just help you calculate these things in your head kind of quickly. It's worth knowing that if something doubles every year, then obviously it will double 10 times in a decade, and 10 doublings is 2 to the power 10. One thing you should know, especially as a computer scientist, is that 2 to the power 10 is 1024. That's where k comes from. It's the kind of binary approximation to 1,000, right? It's close enough, right? So 2 to the power 10 is 1024, roughly speaking 1,000. So if things double every year, they would increase by a factor of 1,000 in a decade. On the other hand, if they only doubled every 2 years, which is what Moore said from 1975 onwards, that's 5 doublings. 2 to the power 5 is 32, so you're looking at 30-fold increase per decade. So that's kind of what we see now, that the density of transistors on the chip increases by a factor of about 30 every 10 years. Then there's a compromise position. If you talk about doubling every 1.5 years, which was the kind of performance accelerating curve, that's 6.6. 2 to the 6.6 is very close to 100. So that's a factor of 100 every decade if you were doubling every 1.5 years. Linear powers of 2 turns out to be a useful thing. You should try and do it. It helps you do these sort of calculations when you have to. For example, if you wanted to know what 2 to the power 32 was, the way you'd be able to remember that is that, remember that powers add when you multiply things together, right? So 2 to the 10 times 2 to the 10 is 2 to the 20, times 2 to the 10 is 2 to the 30, times 2 to the 2 is 2 to the 32. So you can break this 32 down into 10 and 10 and 10 and 2. So now, if you just happen to remember what 2 to the 10 is, and what is it? 1024, right? If you remember that's about 1,000, and you know that 2 to the 2 is 4, which is not terribly hard to work out, you can look at this and you can say, right, that's 1,000 times 1,000 times 1,000 times 4, or you can do 1024 if you want to be exact, and the end result of that is 4 billion and a bit. So, and I would normally look at this and just say 1,000, 1,000, 1,000, 1,000, million, billion, 4 billion. And that's how you know that 2 to the power 32 is 4 billion, if anyone asks you. And it does come up occasionally, because if you're working on a 32-bit app, how much memory can you address? 4 billion bytes, 4 gig, and you can't have more than that if you've got a 32-bit address. So that's what Moore's law says. And it's been hugely influential because it means that if you're trying to work out where tech is going to be a couple of years down the line, this is roughly how you can predict what will be possible. And everybody knows it, everyone in the field knows it, including the chip manufacturers who know it. And the funny thing is that it's partly a self-fulfilling prophecy. I mean, some of it is that it's just the nature of these systems that as they improve them every year, they tweak things and they keep tweaking, and the tweaks are about the same. Like every year they can tweak it by the same amount, so it scales. But also, when they're making their plans for what the world's going to look like in 5 years, they use Moore's law to figure out where they need to be, and then they set their targets based on Moore's law. So everybody knows that that's the game that everyone's playing. So like when Apple are trying to work out, how powerful the next iteration of the iPhone is going to be, they're looking at the Moore's law tables, and so the people who are making the chips, and that's how they work out how fast it will be able to be, in 2 years from now when they release it. This is how it's all figured out. So the real reasons as to why Moore's law holds are quite complicated, but I've given you a simplified version of it there, and that's probably enough. And yes, everyone uses it for their planning, so this is how people work out technology trends. And indeed, it does have predictive power. You can kind of work out what's going to happen if you know Moore's law, and that means that when you're trying to anticipate the future, there's a famous quote by a ice hockey player called Wayne Gretzky, who said, the trick is not to skate to where the puck is, you have to skate to where the puck is going, not to where it is. So again, if you're planning something, you want to allow for the Moore's law changes that will happen during your development process. Basically, the key thing here is when you're making a game, or at least it's a little bit different now, but it used to be the case that when you made a computer game for the PC, for example, and you're working on it and you think it's going to take about 2 years to get it finished, it's like, well, what target spec should you be aiming for? Well, basically, double what you start with was roughly what you did. So what you would do is you would buy the kind of fastest PC you could get at the start of the project, and you would expect that would be min spec by the end of it. And that's how you would work out what how much to put in the game to try and figure out what kind of target machine you'd be aiming at. A little bit different with consoles, of course. Consoles are fixed capacity. The question would just be, are we working for this generation or the next one? But if it was the next one, you'd have to say, well, is the next generation going to be 10 times as powerful as the previous one, or 4 times, or what? So Moore's law has got an interesting status. We call it a law. Obviously, it's not a strict law, like a physical, like a law of physics. It's really just a rule of thumb. But it's been quite a reliable one, and it certainly has some predictive value to it, so it's worth knowing about it. I have a little anecdote for you about Moore's law, because it has some weird consequences, this idea about how fast the growth in transistors and computing is going to be. The guy called Danny Hillis is actually quite a famous physicist and thinker who founded a company in the early 80s called Thinking Machines Corp that was trying to work on massively parallel computing before it was fashionable. And that didn't really succeed, although that idea has since turned out to be a good idea. That you'll probably know now that lots of machines, including just ordinary computers that you buy, they haven't just got one processor on them, they've got multiple cores. And that, in fact, it's kind of related to the Moore's law thing, because Moore's law means you've got more and more transistors, and what you're going to do with them. You can't just keep turning the clocks up higher and higher because you reach clocking limits. So what you do instead is some of those transistors, you put them on a separate core, and now your computer's got 2 computers in it, or 4 computers, or 16. And now you have the problem of having to write programs that can work that way. So you have all the difficulties of writing parallel code. So Danny Hillis tried to sort of pioneer some of that back in the day. This is a story that I've met him at a conference once, and he said that in the 70s he'd predicted that if you take that Moore's law curve and you just keep it going, because there was no particular reason to assume that it wouldn't keep going for a bit, eventually there would be more computers in the world than people, right? Now, in the 1970s, that sounded ridiculous. We didn't have home computers yet. Even the idea that an individual person would own a computer was kind of far-fetched, although some people thought it would happen. But computers were, owned by institutions and banks and universities. So this idea that there would be more computers than people sort of seemed absurd. I mean, why would a person need more than one computer, right? Except today, I bet you all have more than one computer. You've got your real computer, your phone, your games machines, all your other electronic devices in the house that have got computers in them, including your washing machine, right? So you've got tons of computers. You personally own many computers, almost certainly. But when Danny told this story, someone said to him, that's ridiculous. What are we going to do with more computers than we have people? We're going to put them inside doorknobs. Well, it turns out that when Danny Hillis went back to that very same hotel where he gave that speech, the next time he went there, it had an electronic computerized lock, which means actually, yes, there was a computer in the doorknob. And that's the way the world is now. There's another funny implication of Moore's law, which I'll just tell it to you and see what you think of it. So I tried to find this paper again, and I've never really found it, but I swear I read this many years ago. This is a researcher who was working on some huge data processing task, and it was going to be like super intense. It was going to take 4 years to crunch the data. So he made a proposal to his funders that they send him on holiday for a year to do nothing, trusting that in that time Moore's law would mean that computers would be twice as fast. Then he would buy a twice as fast computer in a year. That twice as fast computer would only take 2 years to crunch the numbers. Add on his 1 year of holiday at the start, and you get to the end point in 3 years instead of 4. Well, that sounds like a win, doesn't it? So that almost seems like the correct idea. But they didn't go for it. He didn't manage to get his free year in the Bahamas, even though part of me thinks he really should have done, even for having the balls to suggest the idea. And as I mentioned earlier, you do a version of this when you plan games. You kind of look at the trajectory of where the tech's going to be to work out what you're going to, what your target specs are going to be. And if you misjudge it, you get problems. If you judge this the wrong way, you'll either come out with a game where the min spec is too out of reach, so you can't you can't get high sales because you need to have like a super fancy computer to play it, or you do it the other way and you don't aim high enough and your game just won't look as good and shiny as other people's games because you've aimed too low in terms of your hardware specs. This is a nice little pictorial representation of what Moore's Law has done for the world. That's the original Lara, and these are the various other iterations over time. And it's important to realise that, obviously some of this is, like, as the industry has developed, people have got better at doing stuff. Some of it is improved skill on the part of practitioners, but it's not all that. And in fact, the main driver is just the hardware's getting better. It's like, it wasn't as if this guy couldn't draw when he did her with, like, the really crude face. It was like, we only had that many polygons. It was a PlayStation 1. This was all we could do. And this is how it kind of gets better over time, very much as Moore would have anticipated. So the big question with Moore's Law is always, will it continue? As I hinted earlier, it can't continue forever, right? No sort of exponential growth curve can continue forever in a finite world. Eventually you'll hit some kind of limit somewhere. And with Moore's Law, they're always saying, look, if you keep looking at it, at some point, these theoretical transistors that you've got that keep getting smaller all the time, eventually they become sub-atom sized. And it's like, well, we don't know how to make subatomic transistors yet, although people are looking at that kind of thing. And we are getting to that danger zone now where the transistors are incredibly small. They're kind of nanoscale things, and the physics starts to become very peculiar at that level, and it's really hard to make them. But nevertheless, they always seem to come up with a new trick that allows them to do things like stacking the transistors on top of one another, so they're not actually smaller, but it feels that way because you've got two layers of transistors and this kind of thing. There are other problems with like power consumption, heat dissipation. They become very difficult as you get to the extremes in Moore's Law. That's one of the reasons why clock rates for computers haven't really gone up much recently. They got to the point where they can't clock them any faster because there's too much thermal difficulties, reliability difficulties. So yet another graph, again, logarithmic scale up here. And here, the blue line here, the top one, is the number of transistors, which indeed is following the trend just the way it was supposed to. But one thing you'll notice is that there's a big bend here, at this point here, in about 2004 or something, where clock speeds flattened off. And this is where they couldn't keep also increasing the clock speed. They could increase the number of transistors, but they couldn't clock them a lot faster. And that's why we're in this kind of strange plateau period that still exists right now, where clock speeds don't really go up that much, even though transistor counts do. And that's where things are just now. This is an old talk that you can maybe watch on your own if you care. I'm not strongly recommending it, but if you're an enthusiast, you might want to watch it. The funny thing is, it was by like a senior chip architect, the guy who came up with the Pentium Pro, and he was talking in 2013 and anticipating that by 2020 we might have run out of road. We might have reached the limits of what Moore's Law can achieve, but we haven't quite. But a lot of people did think that we're entering the kind of end zone for Moore's Law now. But they always have done. I found a paper from 1980 saying we're entering the end zone for Moore's Law, making all the same arguments that, again, that the transistors were getting too small, it was too hard to manufacture them, it couldn't keep going. They thought that it would end in 1980, and it didn't. And I'm sure people thought it would end in 1990, and it didn't. And this keeps happening. One day they'll be right. One day it will end. But it tends to be the safer bet to assume that it will keep going. If you assume that it will keep going, you'll only be wrong once. Whereas if you assume that it's going to stop, you might be wrong multiple times. And yeah, they're always working on new tech to try and say that maybe even once we reach what we currently think are the physical barriers, like a totally new design for transistors, or switch to like optical switching, not really transistors at all. And the same way that the transistor was a revolutionary reimagining of the valve. Maybe there's another thing we need to do. Maybe there'll be some totally new thing that will come along. Yes, but certainly clock speeds have tailed off, that's true, and as a kind of consequence of that, we've moved to multi-core systems because we can't just keep having... What a programmer would like? A programmer would like a computer to just have one core in it and it to be super fast, because it's easier to program then. It's easier to program linear code, but that's not what they give us anymore. They say, no, you're not getting that. We're giving you 128 GPU cores and you have to figure out how to make it work. And that's the way things have gone. Here's another example of the innovations that they've made. This is when they did what Intel called 3D transistors. It was just an attempt to pack the transistors more tightly on the chip. It's the kind of thing they've had to do to get the densities up over time. As of 2017, they were trying to get down to the so-called 10 nanometer process. I should point out, when they say 10 nanometer, that doesn't actually mean the real size of the transistor anymore. It used to, but it's such an arcane process making chips now that these numbers are actually somewhat symbolic in some ways, but you can roughly think of them as being kind of the size of the transistors, but it's not really. And getting down to 5 nanometers, which is what they do for the kind of processes that you have about now, has been really difficult, but they did manage to do it. It took a couple of years longer than anticipated, though, so there has been a little decline in chip, in the trends of chip performance recently, because it's been really hard to get down to these very small sizes that we use now. But as of right now, Intel thinks that Moore's Law is still on track. They think that with all the various tricks that they can do now and that they anticipate doing in future, they think that we can still get 50 times more transistors than we have right now over the next couple of cycles. That'll be like over the next, 10 years or so. So they think they can keep doing it. So the consequence of this to me is that we should probably just assume that there's still a bit more room for miniaturization, which will be good because we need it for various things we'd like to have. Like, would anyone like to have like the super brilliant AR glasses that you can wear that superimpose things on your view and can be like computers that fit inside spectacles? That's going to require denser technology than we have just now. That's probably going to need about 50 times more density than we have right now. So if you want technology like that to ever be possible, we're going to have to cross our fingers and hope that Moore's Law keeps working for us. And I think it's reasonably assumed that it will for a while yet. Things will still get a bit smaller and faster. And here's some final quotes about history. History is a pack of lies about events that never happened, told by people who weren't there. I feel like I've insulted myself there. Obviously, I wasn't personally involved in Moore's Law, but that's what I think happened. History is merely a list of surprises. It can only prepare us to be surprised yet again. And history will be kind to me, for I intend to write it. That's a famous history quote. Anyone know who said that? It was Churchill, yes. That one is actually correctly attributed to Winston Churchill. Okay, so that's where I will draw the line today, I think. Go here and stop it.